Hello and very nice to see everyone again. This is the next in my series of Connected Compliance Dialogues. And this week for my Connected Compliance Dialogue, I'm joined by Amber Kagan of GE. Amber is the Chief Compliance Officer and the Head of Global Labour and Employment at GE. Amber, very nice to see you and thanks very much for joining me.
Great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
And so I imagine you and your team have all been remote for a few months now, is that right?
Yeah, since about March.
Okay. And how have you been managing the compliance program while you've all been in different locations?
I got to be honest with you, without missing a beat. My team is just a group of hardworking, extremely professional, compliant, long-term compliance folks, and they just haven't missed a beat. In fact, we are, as I think you and I have spoken, in the process of doing a really huge transformation to our entire corporate compliance program. And as of yesterday, I found out I am basically one policy away from it being done. And they did a huge bulk of that remotely. So while it's not as enjoyable and I miss the day-to-day face-to-face interaction, I got to say the team has not missed a beat.
In terms of your role as Chief Compliance Officer, have you had to reprioritize any of your objectives this year?
I would say that we have some potential new risk areas. So you've got a whole new COVID risk that is really more on our environmental safety group than it is our group. But what we did do is go back through every one of our main policies to see whether we needed to make any adjustments, any tweaks to those to cover COVID situations. So we did that. There's, like I said, I had to come out with all kinds of policies and procedures for, like everybody, for safely re-entering the workplace. That really wasn't my group that much. We played a little role in that. IT cyber is always a risk, but I think everybody's feeling the same thing as people are working remotely. Worry a little bit more about losing IP, about more carelessness than intentional. But to be honest, so, we looked at all those things like I'm sure every company did. We've made changes to things where we've needed to, but for the most part, our priorities really have not changed, and my teams remain focused on doing what they need to do.
And what kind of adjustments were you finding you needed to make to your policies and processes?
You just wanted to make sure that all our pay process policies were adjusted the way we needed to adjust them to make sure we were doing the right thing by employees for COVID. That, health and safety policies were adjusted as necessary. Work from home policy was a big one. Make sure that we got all that right. There were, a whole host of policies that touched on various issues that were touched on by COVID that we just wanted to make sure, on the employment side, was our accommodation process and policy good enough to deal with COVID situation. So things like that. There were a lot of them that we tweaked, but they were tweaks, we didn't really have, other than obviously re-entering the workforce, which was new. We really didn't have any big gaps. It was just, okay, let's look at it with a COVID lens and see if we need to make any changes.
And so tell me a little bit more about your transformation project that you've been undertaking.
It's been pretty vast, actually. As I know, we've changed our whole operating structure at GE to be moving from one that was more centrally focused to one that is much more business focused. And so that's impacted us across the board, all functions. And so before, our compliance function was never a totally corporate led by any means. That would never work. The businesses have always had very strong compliance functions within each business, but there were a lot of things that were more centrally led. And so we had to decentralize all of that. And what we really did was we took the opportunity to, while we were shifting from what was more of an operational role to what I would say is more of a governance role now over the businesses. And so we have redone every one of our policies, which is a pretty massive effort. Actually, that's about to get rolled out. I think September 1, we're finishing translations, just went through Works Council approval. So that's done. What we also did was we created 21, 22, what we call enterprise standards, which we did not have before, which, given that we're decentralizing, I and corporate needs to feel comfortable that each of the businesses are dealing with all of the significant risks that we as a company have or they may have from a business specific perspective. And so we've come out with these enterprise standards, which are all brand new, which for each big risk area kind of lays out what are those risks that we at corporate really care about and that each business needs to have a documented control to handle. For the most part, we try not to be prescriptive about what the control was, the what, not the how, requiring that every business have a monitoring function. So now every enterprise standard has monitoring requirements that they have to do and KPIs ultimately that they'll have to report to us. And we've got an assurance standard. We've got a great internal audit team that my team works at corporate very closely with to audit all the businesses. It was just a huge effort. We've been at this for a year and a half. We've made tweaks to our training program because that too is being a little bit more decentralized, and businesses have to create training and communications plans that they submit to us, which they've been doing in our ombuds program. That one was, frankly, we had to make the least changes to that because that was already decentralized and running pretty well. But even there, we've added additional KPIs, which has been really good because some of the areas where we're having look, what you measure, you do. We all know that. And we're seeing good progress from the businesses in meeting some of the challenges we were having in some of those areas where we put in some new KPIs. So more to it than that, but at a high level, it kind of is an entirely new compliance program. And we are almost rolled out. The businesses are now doing their gap analyses to figure out where they have those gaps and what they need to fill them. It's a challenge in a environment that GE is going through right now, as I'm sure you're aware, and cost constraints and cost out. It's a challenge. But the businesses and corporate have done an amazing job of collaborating on this.
Well, congratulations on having rolled that out during a pandemic. I mean, I think that's incredibly impressive to have achieved that in any normal environment, let alone one where you're all remote and hamstrung a little bit by the situation you find yourselves in. So Amber, tell me a little bit about Black Lives Matter. I mean, during this pandemic, it's been an incredibly high profile topic of conversation, not just in the US, but all around the world. And I was wondering, from your perspective as an American, but also in charge of risk of GE, an enormous global organization, what is your perspective on this movement and how is it going to impact the way that GE does business?
I think it's had a profound impact. Much like COVID, we've really had to reassess what are our policies and how do we want to handle some of these issues that are coming up. But I just took a more pure look at it, right? I want to talk about what they stand for. Our CEO came out pretty early and said that it is our position, of course, that every Black life does matter. And he's come out quite a few times and giving his view on this.
And do you think that the conversation within your workforce has changed? Are you having more candid conversations about race and some of the challenges and the kind of institutionalized racism of our organizations and our countries?
100%. And it's funny because as a labor and employment lawyer, I'm one of the ones that was always saying those conversations in the workplace, right? And we all know there's risk to them, particularly when you're a company like GE, with 200,000 plus employees all over the world with a vast array of views on things. Having these conversations in the workplace is risky. Labor and employment lawyers hate it. I actually, to be honest, was probably one of the first people that went out there and said, we're going to have these conversations. I actually called my entire L&E team across the company. I said, we're not going to stop these conversations. We need to make sure people have them professionally and that people are not being offensive. But I took that position that we're going to take that risk because this is a conversation we have to have. So there's no question I've had them. We are having conversations that we haven't had before. And I have to say, I mean, I don't know every conversation that goes on across the company, of course, but the feedback I've gotten, of all my years, of all the feedback I've gotten, I have gotten more positive feedback from employees about my willingness to have these conversations than on anything else I can recall. So I think, you do it professionally, you do it appropriately, but we are long overdue for those conversations.
Look, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, what is interesting is that the candor that the conversations around Black Lives Matter and race issues has brought has been really game-changing, I think, in terms of the workplace culture in a general sense. And I wonder whether there will be actually really positive impacts on compliance ultimately, because we're able to have these much more open conversations about really difficult issues. And so my view is that culture is so important when you're managing risk, and that actually there might be some unintended, really positive benefits for the compliance environment to having pushed the envelope in terms of the kinds of conversations we're having with our colleagues.
I think everything could be under the umbrella of compliance, but I think from a diversity perspective and an inclusion perspective, 100%, right? Having these conversations are necessary and helpful, and will help us become a better company and make sure we have policies, we're doing the right things. So that's for sure. From a compliance perspective, it's always good to have people talking. So we already have an environment where I think people feel pretty good. There's always some fear of retaliation. That's normal, but feel pretty good about raising things. The race was just not one of those things anybody ever felt comfortable talking. It's uncomfortable. I mean, I have asked questions of my Black colleagues that I would never have asked because I just want to know. And they've been amazing about it, so I think in the diversity space and the inclusion space, having these conversations is critical. In the overall compliance, I mean, I guess the only tie-in I see is it's more willingness for the company to have discussions and to let people express their views, which is always a good thing as long as it's done appropriately.
Yeah, I agree. Well, look, Amber, it's been absolutely fantastic to connect with you, notwithstanding a few interruptions and technical challenges, but that's what comes with this virtual environment. And look, I hope we have an opportunity to connect again very soon, but thank you very much for spending time with me.
Sure, it was great. Thanks for having me.